Okay, let's open with prayer. Father, we are so privileged to know you. It is so liberating to rejoice in our Creator rather than fight against Him and attempt to deny your existence. We gladly acknowledge that you are God, and we do so with worship in our hearts and on our lips. And Lord, I would pray for Richard Dawkins. I pray that you would soften his heart and pray that you would help him, give him eyes to see what he is so intent on not seeing. Lord, you saved the Apostle Saul of Tarsus, and you can save him. So we would pray that you would do it. Help us to glorify you in our class today, we ask in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so I think last time we ended with the objection that belief in God is the product of misguided human imagination, not the rigorous scientific application of the senses. That was the one we left off with last time. So here's another one let's talk about. Ignorance of nature gave birth to the idea of God, just as a deeper knowledge of nature allows humanity to destroy this idea and the evils resulting from it. Okay? So take a minute to read that again. Ignorance of nature gave birth to the idea of God, just as a deeper knowledge of nature allows humanity to destroy this idea of God and the evils resulting from it. Okay? So that's the objection. Pretty common one, even though this is an old one. It's still a very common one. What would you say in response?
I'd say part of it is the more we try to understand nature, the more we realize we can't understand. If you take light, for example, we still can't explain light. There are things that are beyond our comprehension, and that doesn't, to me, that doesn't prove that there isn't a God.
Okay, so there's things that still baffle the scientists. In fact, we'll see a major question for scientists that natural explanations still can't explain is, how did it all start? So, yeah, there are huge questions that nature does not explain. Okay, what about this concept of deeper knowledge of nature allows humanity to destroy the idea of God? So Robbie sort of challenged that idea. But what about this, the evils resulting from it? There's sort of a built-in assumption there that if we get rid of the idea of God, we'll also get rid of a lot of the problems of the world. What do you think about that? How would you respond? Go ahead, and then Nelson.
Look at the governments that have tried to do that.
Yes.
The Soviet Union and China. I was talking to Jojo yesterday about what government China is like as a result of that, and it's just terrible atrocities, and that's the result of trying to get rid of God.
Okay.
That's not a valid.
It's an ignorance of history.
Yeah, exactly. They don't understand. They're not looking at history.
Yeah, the 20th century alone, under atheist regimes, is the most brutal, has been the most brutal in history. Nelson?
I was just going to point out, not all times, but a lot of times the idea of God has prevented a lot of evil, like thinking about that and trying to live a Christian life. Or even, Muslims have suicide bombings, but several times they try to live a better life than making things worse, like living for yourself.
There is a new book out entitled Atheist Delusion. They're all piggybacking off of Dawkins' God Delusion. Yeah, David, I believe it's Bentley Hart. I believe it's published by Yale. I'm just reading the first chapter of it at the moment, but this book makes this point very strongly. In fact, it's a whole book-length treatment of your point, Nelson, that Christianity has been an incredibly liberating force. Now, there's been evils done in the name of Christianity, but that is contrary to the message of Christianity. And it shows in contrast to other revolutions in the world that Christianity has actually done the most good. So this statement is really not empirically valid. It's just sort of a bias, that it's an assumption that religion is, and usually people are thinking of Christianity, is equated with evils. And the new atheists make that charge. And of course they don't limit it to Christianity. Obviously they have lots of examples with Islam and that kind of thing. But they lump them all together. But Christianity does seem to be the main target. Let me give you a few facts here. Under Soviet communism, an estimated 85 to 100 million people were executed. And of course, Soviet communism was atheistic communism, right? They tried to eliminate God, make God illegal. Alistair McGrath, the book I mentioned last time, The Twilight of Atheism, chronicles some of this material. And he points out a very interesting quote. The 20th century gave rise to one of the greatest and most distressing paradoxes of human history. That the greatest intolerance and violence of the century were practiced by those who believed that religion caused intolerance and violence. The greatest intolerance and violence of the century were practiced by those who believed that religion caused intolerance and violence. Now, this is an interesting point, because if you look at the new atheists and Darwinianism in general, one of their fundamental characteristics is trying to outlaw the teaching of creation or intelligent design. Well, isn't this a postmodern context where we're supposed to be tolerant of people's ideas? But Expel does an amazing job of bringing out how intolerant Darwinianism is. So there's a huge irony at work there. Okay, let's move on to a German philosopher, Ludwig Feuerbach. He was someone who did not like religion. He sort of just has that look about him, doesn't he? You can tell he would not approve of you going to church on Sunday morning. In 1841, he argued that God was basically an invention dreamed up by human beings to comfort us. And again, this is a common explanation of the universal impulse to believe in a God, which itself is a bit problematic to naturalistic explanations, although they have attempts at explanations. So, here's his argument. There is no God. But we come back and say, but lots of people believe in God. That's sort of an understatement if you look at the history of humanity. Now, you could change this, or put in brackets, gods. Lots of people believe in God or gods. So why? His explanation is simply this: because they want to be comforted. So they project or objectify their longings and call this God. This non-existent God is simply the projection of human longings. So in reality, there's no God. How do we account for religion, belief in God? It's just a projection of human longings. Okay, so my question is, how would you respond to Ludwig?
There's a lot of things about God that I would not project, that I would not make up.
Okay, that's an interesting. Like what?
Like his wrath.
Okay.
And the way that we're called to give up everything to follow him. Like, those aren't things I would want.
Okay, when we're talking specifically about Christianity, that's a good point. There are certainly dimensions of the Christian God that we would not project. We would not, even the gospel itself, that is counterintuitive, right? Because it seems natural for humans to want to earn their own way, and most religions are really a religion of works. So, good. What else might you say? There's someone else. Jeremy, was it? Okay.
I think it's the ontological argument. Why do we even have this desire or this longing at all?
Okay. So, you could bring in the ontological argument. Interesting. Another argument that, remember, I think C.S. Lewis makes it in Mere Christianity. Beauty, or the anthropological argument. Wanting something does not prove it does not exist. And you remember his illustrations, human thirst points for the need for water. Okay, so wanting something does not prove it doesn't exist. In fact, just the opposite. Often our longings point to a reality that can be fulfilled, whether it's desire for food, desire for drink. And you remember Lewis's statement in Mere Christianity: if I find in myself a longing that nothing on this earth can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. That's a paraphrase. Danny?
I was going to say, I think you almost have a point. You go back to and practically live out. I think a lot of people do. You hear it in the Bible talking about God saying, you've made gods of your own. You want to make that fashioned after you.
Yeah.
So that's not an invalid attack to religion.
To religion.
In general.
Okay.
That's true. People did and still do make gods according to their own longing, and so in a sense that is a valid attack, not Christianity, but
okay. In fact, that's a very good point. You could agree with him up to a certain point, and that's an explanation for the phenomena of religions. But then you can move to the uniqueness of Christianity, which is what Sean was saying, right? Adam.
I was going to say, like what Danny was saying, it's not necessarily a projection of human longings, but human desires is religion. And then you can kind of bring it, well, what do we not want, but what do we need? And that's when you bring in Christianity. This guy, like Danny was saying, is just mostly what we want, what we desire. We want a God who can just put in a nickel in the slot machine and pump out prosperity, right?
Right. Okay, very good observations. There's one other way you can turn this around. Alistair McGrath points out, all worldviews are a response to human needs and desires, including, of course, atheism, which can be seen as a response to the human desire for moral autonomy. So you could turn, what McGrath is saying is you can basically turn this around and say, well, in fact, atheism is simply a desire to not want to play by God's rules. So we desire that there's no God. We don't want to be accountable to God, right? We want moral autonomy. We want independence from God. So we just conveniently say, well, there is no God. So that way I'm not accountable to anybody. I can do whatever I want. Isn't that just as much a projection of our longings as theism? Nelson?
Should we use this as an argument for God, or should we just use this as knocking down the argument that is just a response for...
Well, I think in our discussion, we've come up with some helpful things, because I think you can do both. I think you can point out the weakness of that person's argument through something like this. You can move to granting some validity to the argument as seen in the religious phenomena, but then move to the uniqueness of Christianity.
So it's not like in itself an argument. It's all, well, I mean, let's say right. I just feel like it's kind of like a little loop. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's, again, how do you respond to these kind of arguments? Here's several ways you can do that. Yeah.
Wouldn't this sort of be showing how your presuppositions will determine...
Yes, exactly. This is sort of a presuppositional response.
So then after this, you go into that, just talking about a presupposition.
Right.
Which better fits the reality.
Right. Good. That's helpful. Okay. So, again, this response here illustrates that a lot of people who don't believe in God, remember we were talking last time about listening and asking questions, there's usually a deeper issue. And I suspect that this is at the heart of a lot of atheism. Moral autonomy, not wanting to be accountable to a higher being. It's interesting, there's been tests, psychological tests conducted for example, one test you do with kids, okay? You bring them into a room and there's some present, okay, and you tell them about. And the way the experiment goes forward is you tell some of the kids that there is sort of like I don't know if you'd say a god, but there's a princess or a prince watching that knows what's going on in this room, okay? And if you please the prince, then you'll get the present. You tell that to half the kids. The other kids, you don't tell anything about. You don't introduce it that way. You just say, "Here's a present. If you're good, you can have it," or whatever. Then the person says, "Oh, I just got to go out of the room for a minute, and I'll be back." So, guess what happens? The kids who think there's someone watching don't open it and peek inside to see what's there because they think someone's watching. The kids who are not told that, I don't think it's inevitably, but most of them do peek because they don't think there's any accountability. They're just going to, yeah. So it's interesting, this concept of moral autonomy. It's much more convenient for us in our human fallenness to project there's no God, because then we can live how we wish. Okay, Daniel, can you hand these out for me, please? I want to move now to Dawkins. Here's the book. He's written others, obviously. And probably the most popular of all of the new atheists is Richard Dawkins, because he's got maybe a more visible status than most of the others. So I want to deal with his central argument. Okay, so you have the handout. Let's discuss the central argument. And this, what I've given you is, there he is there. What I've given you is his own summary. Okay, so these 6 points come right out of his book. Now, they're sort of summaries of his summary, just because they're kind of wordy, but let's walk through this. Dawkins' central argument. Number one of the greatest challenges to the human intellect over the centuries has been to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. 2, the natural temptation, interesting concession here, the natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. And he points out the example of a watch, which is, you remember, Paley's blind watchmaker. Other examples that appear to exhibit design, the eye, a wing, a spider, a person. 3, the temptation is a false one because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. It is obviously no solution to postulate something even more improbable. The most ingenious and powerful explanation is Darwinian evolution by natural selection. We can now safely say that the illusion of design in living creatures is just that, an illusion. Now, on your handout, there's a couple of more points. I didn't include them up here because they're not as central. We don't yet have an equivalent explanation for physics. In other words, why are the laws of physics so regulated and so conducive to life? We should not give up hope, number 6, of a better explanation arising in physics, something as powerful as Darwinianism is for biology. Okay, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist. Okay, so you get his point. Point is, you look at the universe and he grants the temptation is to say it looks like there's been design, but we can't say that because what? Who designed the designer? Right. Right. So it's no solution, he's saying, to come up with a more complicated explanation. Evaluation. This is his central argument of the book by his own claim. Okay, so how do you respond? Yep. No.
This is kind of like to the cosmological argument. Something has to come from somewhere to start with. And so if something had to come from somewhere, then you could assume it had design in it. I mean, it could also have design where it came from itself. I don't know.
Okay. But he's saying we can't conclude that the universe has been designed because that leads us into a more complicated explanation.
So he'd be up for there's something eternal, but it didn't have design in itself?
Well, that's sort of a good point. You know, what is his explanation? Because this is not really just a problem for intelligent design people. If you are a materialist, you run into the same brick wall. Right? Because, okay, well, who created or how do you explain materialism? So there's an infinite regress there, too. Okay, Ana Lucia.
I feel like the designer doesn't have to have another designer because he's outside of the design himself. It's like a painting. You can't say, okay, who invented the one who painted it because he's outside of the painting. So that doesn't even, apply. It's not consistent.
Okay, so it does not, if I can summarize what I think you're saying, does not invalidate the explanation to say, or it does not invalidate the reality of the painting to say there was a painter, right?
Right, you can say there was a designer, but to say that who designed the designer, that just doesn't make sense because the designer's outside of the designers.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
And then either way, you're having to say something has always existed because either the earth always existed somehow or there was a God that always existed. So it kind of balances each other out, you know?
Yeah, I think what he would say to that is, no, well, okay, that's your Christian explanation, but really what we're left with is infinite regress. We just keep going a step back and back and back. And Christians try to stop that by saying, well, there's an infinite God, eternal God. But, okay, what's your explanation then, Dawkins? There's even, I think, a more, and I think we're very close to this, but there's an even more fundamental logical problem here. And that is, in order to recognize a legitimate explanation, you don't have to have an explanation for the explanation. Do you follow that? Let me say it again. In order to recognize a legitimate explanation, you don't have to have an explanation for the explanation. Okay, now let me illustrate that. Stonehenge. You've all seen this, right? This is a prehistoric monument in England, dating from about the mid-3rd millennium BC. So this is really, really, really old. Apparently it was some kind of burial ground. Now, you don't have to be able to explain who designed the builders of this to infer that this structure is the work of intelligent agents. You follow me there? In other words, we don't have to know where the builders of this came from to know that it was built by someone. Right? So apply that to Dawkins. You don't have to understand where the designer came from to postulate as a legitimate explanation that the universe was designed. Okay? Now, let me give you another explanation. Were any of you Y kids? You know what a Y kid is? Caitlin, my youngest, is a Y kid. You can sort of even tell from this picture that she would be a Y kid. But you say to this type of kid, it's time to take a bath. And what do they say? Why? Because you're dirty. Well, because you were playing outside. Because it was a nice day. Because the sun was out, it was warm. And, right? You get there's an infinite regress with these kids. But, yeah, right. But think about it. Each answer is an explanation to the question. Right? Okay. It's time to take a bath. Why? Because you're dirty. That's an explanation. Now, asking why doesn't negate the information provided. It just raises a separate question. So you see how that illustrates this Dawkins central argument? Nelson?
So what he's asking is one of our presuppositions we can't prove. Is the design of our designer.
Yeah.
You would ask in response to one of his presuppositions.
Yeah. 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 So William Lane Craig sums this up with this statement. In order to recognize that intelligent design is the best explanation of the appearance of design in the universe, one needn't be able to explain the designer. I think that's logical, right? Seems obvious, but this is a central argument of Dawkins' book.
So basically what Dawkins is doing is exactly what your daughter was saying. Like, if you can't explain why the sun came up, therefore I don't have to take it back.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Robbie?
What I understand is how he can say that design is probable, because if you take Stonehenge and you have two people with two different explanations. One person says someone set up those rocks that way. I can't show you that person, but it looks like someone set up. And the other person says over a long period of time, glaciers are moving and crushing rocks, and these kind of fell together this way.
Yeah.
The design sounds way more probable in that instance.
Right.
I can say the design is improbable just because it's design.
Well, it's very interesting because in Expelled, he sort of gets trapped in that. And we'll see that in a minute. And it does bring, because this is a key point for Dawkins, for Darwinians in general, is they don't have an explanation for the origin of the universe either. They can tell you the process of how it developed, but they can't tell you how it began.